Good morning again. Right now we are in a science lesson. Rocks are changed by heat and plants. This lesson is due on March 30th, on Monday, March 30th. That's what day it should be when you watch this video. Now, before we begin our lesson, I want to make sure that you remind yourself of what your vocabulary words mean. Right now, I would like you to hit the pause button on your screen and study these words. All right. Now I would like you to hit the pause button once again and study these vocabulary words. Pay close attention to basalt. All right, and one more time, I want you to pause the screen and study these vocabulary words. Make sure you know what each one refers to. Do you remember how to say this word?
Feldspar.
And this one?
Nice.
All right, if you have studied, we will begin today's science lesson. Rocks are changed by heat and plants. Now, last week we learned that rock can be changed by wind and by water. Do you remember the really cool pictures of like mountains that we saw that have been carved by wind blowing sand? It's very interesting. And of course, water can change rock too. Now, nature can change rocks in other ways too. Plants and heat can also cause rocks to change. Here are two more words. You should be fairly familiar with these. You need to make sure you know which one's which. Biology. Biology is the study of life. This word right here, bio, we're referring to life. And I've told you before that geo means earth. So geography, geology, all of those words refer to things about the earth. Geology, the study of rocks, which is of course what our earth is made up of. That might be a better definition. By heat and cold. Hot and cold weather causes rocks to change too, Father said. How? Rick wondered. Well, when the sun beats down, the rocks get very warm. When the sun goes down, Father continued, it gets cold very fast. Sometimes this change in temperature causes tiny cracks to form in the rocks. If water gets into these cracks and freezes, it turns to ice. The ice presses against the walls of the rock. Chunks of rock break off. Some roll to the bottom of the mountain. You might remember this. I know we've talked about it in class, about how you, of course, don't take a can of Coke and put it in the freezer. We talked about what would happen. It would explode because the Coke in the can, as it freezes, expands. And water does that too. When water freezes, it expands. So water pours down into the cracks in the rocks, and when it freezes, it pushes out against the rock, and then rocks break off. We saw that in the film, Debbie said. Remember the sign, danger, falling rocks? Yes, her uncle replied. Rocks high on the mountain had broken off and had rolled down the mountainside onto the road. Does it take a long time for rocks to break apart? Mary asked. A very long time, her father answered. Geologists think that it takes about 1,000 years for a mountain to wear away, only 4 inches, 10 centimeters. I guess I won't be able to see much change then in Mr. Scott's mountain when we go back, Mary laughed. Now, of course, during the flood, there was a ton of water and a huge amount of change in our world because the whole earth was shook up by what happened. And so that, of course, caused things to happen very, very quickly, very, very rapidly. The earth changed. 1 week later, Father had exciting news for the club. Rick's Uncle George was a biology teacher at Richmond College, and the club was going to visit him. Uncle George would tell them how plants can change rocks. While they were at the college, they could visit the Geology Museum also. Everyone was so excited. They had never gone to a college before. On the way to Richmond, Rick and Mary noticed many things that they had not seen on other trips. There were boulders, granite on the mountainsides. They knew now that they were igneous rocks. There were smaller rocks along the road, and they knew how they became smaller. Their study of rocks was making them more aware of God's creation. Soon they arrived at Richmond College. Uncle George was so happy to see Rick and meet all the club members. Uncle George took them straight to the Geology Museum, where they met Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore showed them lots of different igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic rocks. They saw rocks of all sizes, shapes, and colors. The museum was a very interesting place. We have been studying how rocks change, Rick told Dr. Moore. We know that water, wind, heat, and cold all work together to change rocks. How do plants help to change rocks? Dr. Moore smiled. I think your Uncle George can answer that better than I can, he said. He's the biologist. Oh, yes, Mary added. We forgot. Uncle George has told us many interesting things about plants before. Tell us about plants and rocks, Uncle George. Uncle George pointed out the window to some large boulders. Do you see how those flat, grayish-green plants that seem to almost cover those big boulders on the lawn? It looks something like moss. See over here? Do you see moss? Yes, replied Uncle George. Those little plants get their food from the solid rock. They send out special juices. These juices help make the rocks soft and crumbly. Water also softens the rocks. The little plants get their food in this way. They send their roots down into the cracks of the softened rock. As the roots grow bigger, they begin to break the rocks apart. Are the roots of the little plants strong enough to break rocks? Debbie asked. I'll let Dr. Moore answer that question, Uncle George answered. He's the geologist. I'll never forget something I saw a few years ago, Dr. Moore began. Every day as I walked from my home to the college, I passed over a patch of road that was cracked. One day, I noticed the crack seemed bigger. The next week, the crack was a little wider. It was springtime, the snow had gone, and the weather was getting warmer. The crack was getting much wider. I began to wonder why the road was cracking open. Was it because water had gotten in and froze? Jack wanted to know. He remembered how water turned into ice and broke up rocks. No, Dr. Moore replied. One day, I stopped to see what was happening. I could hardly believe my eyes. Can you guess what was making the road crack? Maybe an earthquake, Debbie exclaimed. Maybe a truck ran over it and broke it, Mary guessed. Or maybe an elephant stepped on it, Jack said, laughing. Dr. Moore smiled again. No, he said. No one has guessed the right answer. Please tell us, Debbie begged. I found a tiny plant, smaller than my little finger, pushing through the hard rock road's surface. A green plant? Look at this picture over here. Can you imagine? But it does. It can push up through a rock. Yes, a tiny green plant. That was the first time I had ever seen such a small plant break through hard rock. I knew growing roots of big trees could split huge rocks. Probably we've seen rocks that have been split in that way. But here was a tiny green plant, pushing its head up through the thick rock toward the sunshine.